Joining us now from the American Federation for Children is Vice President of Communications and Marketing, Tommy Schultz. Tommy, great to have you on the show. So I'm curious, why do you think more parents are considering long-term homeschooling?
Well, look, I think there's been new data out there showing that only 44% of public school districts are doing any sort of remote learning or check-ins with their students right now. And so it's really not surprising at all that 40% of families are considering homeschooling with their child even after the lockdowns end. And I mean, prior to the pandemic, only about 4% of families were choosing that option. And like you had mentioned, it's bipartisan. More Democrats than Republicans said they were likely to consider homeschooling or enrolling their kid in virtual schooling. 50% of African American families, and the younger you were, the more likely you were to do this. I think a lot of families are either frustrated with the inflexibility of the current system, and two, I think a lot of families are understanding, you know what, this homeschooling stuff isn't so bad. And frankly, this is a pretty restrictive homeschooling environment because there's a lot of social distancing, there's a lot of other things, whereas in a normal kind of home education environment, you're doing activities, you're going to brick and mortar schools a couple days a week, you're doing sports. So that's where I think families are a little fed up potentially. We're spending $15,000 in a public school each year per student. And I bet a lot of families are asking, you know, I think I can do this on my own. It'd be nice to get some funds helping my child do home education right now. So that's why I think you're seeing such high numbers in the poll.
It's also interesting the fact that many years ago, homeschooling, the idea of homeschooling was frowned upon in some circles in our country. I'm curious, what are some benefits to homeschooling other than obviously protecting kids against the virus?
Well, sure. I think when you're looking at home education, as you had sort of alluded to, it was frankly non-existent 50 or 60 years ago. And prior to the pandemic and all the lockdowns happening, you know, about 2.5 million kids were in a home education environment of the eligible 55 or so million kids in K through 12 schools. And that number was not only dramatically rising over the past decade, it's quite clear that after the lockdowns end from this pandemic, a lot of families are going to consider this as an option because they're probably seeing, look, there's less violence going on right now. For instance, education statistics from the federal government shows that 20% of kids in public schools are experiencing bullying or violence when they're going to school. They're also probably seeing that students that may have anxiety, social emotional issues are really thriving in this home environment where they're with their families more often or they're interacting more directly with their teachers one-on-one through virtual environments. So I think that's where you're seeing so much of this eagerness and this uptick in likelihood of support for homeschooling after things open up even.
Yeah, I'm curious in another way, have these lockdowns brought to light everyday sort of issues in our education system, or, you know, is this whole idea of homeschooling just maybe isolated to the pandemic?
Well, look, I think it has really brought to light, just with all of these lockdowns and everything, the real structural flaws within our education system. It is far too rigid. It's essentially one size fits all, but really it's one size fits none. And that's why elsewhere in the poll, 64% of families said that they support school choice overall, and even more support the federal education freedom scholarships proposal, including 67% of Democrats and 70% of Republicans. And I think that's partly because families are agitated with the way that this schooling system we currently have, which was adopted from the 1800s in Prussia, really isn't ready for the 21st century. And especially when there's a new research study that came out showing 700 private schools across the country, 80% of those schools missed less than one instructional day throughout this pandemic. Excuse me, less than 5 days, and 34% missed not a single day of instruction. Whereas, again, that stat I said earlier, 44% of school districts aren't even doing remote learning or are barely doing remote learning. I think a lot of families are frustrated and they want change in the system.
Okay, terrific. Tommy, thank you so much for coming on the show. Tommy is from the American Federation for Children. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you for having me.
You